as we're looking to discover more about the song, really we need to leave this part of Penny Lane and head up to the very, very top, because there is the roundabout where the song is based. As we come down onto the roundabout of Penny Lane, it's a busy thoroughfare. This is St Barnabas Church. This is one of the reasons why Paul McCartney was coming to Penny Lane. He sang in the church choir here when he was about 14 years old. So they're quite proud of their connection with Paul McCartney. But here we are. This is the roundabout of Penny Lane. This is where the song is based. This is where the whole story unfolds. So let's go and explore Penny Lane. So from St Barnabas, Penny Lane, we reveal the roundabout of Penny Lane. Right in the middle, the shelter in the middle of the roundabout. And on the left, the bank and the barbershop. Here, beneath the blue suburban skies, this is what John and Paul were writing about. So why did they call it Penny Lane? Because if you look on a map, it's not called Penny Lane. It's actually called Smithdown Place. So why did they call it Penny Lane? Well, before the Beatles made it famous, the shelter in the middle of the roundabout was a tram shelter and a bus shelter. This is where you queued up and you waited for your bus. So from the age of 5, John was getting the bus here after school and going back to Mimi's house in Wilton. In the morning, when he'd arrive with Mimi, and that didn't last very long, he would get off here and walk down Penny Lane and go to Dovedale School. So the shelter was an important place. Same for George Harrison. When his family moved up into Speke when George was 7, he was getting the bus to here every day and going down Penny Lane and going to Dovedale School as well. Till John and George were 11, they were coming to Penny Lane 5 days a week. So the song is actually important for them. For John, it was an important place because just behind the roundabout, that's where he first lived with his mum, Julia, in number 9 Newcastle Road. Now this area is known locally as the Penny Lane area. So because the buses and the trams stopped at Penny Lane, people called this roundabout the Penny Lane roundabout. And because it is at the heart of this part of suburban Liverpool, with 3 different suburbs all meeting here at the same place. So you've got Mossley Hill down here, and there's the top of Penny Lane. As you swing round and you head up into Wavertree, and then if you head off that way, you're going off into Allerton. All 3 suburbs meet here at this roundabout. So it's the Penny Lane roundabout in the Penny Lane area. So actually, when they were writing the song, they weren't just writing any old song about any old street. In their ears and in their eyes meant this was the childhood of John, Paul and George. John knew this area well. Just along there, it's now a Costa Coffee and a Tesco. That was Woolworths, where Julia, his mum, worked for a time. On this corner is the only one of the original 3 banks still to be a bank today, the TSB. Right next door is Bernardo's, and that was a photo studio by a guy called Albert Marion. And when Brian Epstein became their manager, he was enlisted to take the first photos. They should have been taken here at Penny Lane. There was a mix-up with the booking, so it ended up he went to Albert Marion's other studio over the other side of the River Mersey in Wallasey. So how did the song of Penny Lane come to be written? Well, John was working on In My Life, and he was listing all the places that he remembered, and he starts off with Penny Lane is one I'm missing, and he talks about going up Church Road into the road just up here, so the clock and the Abbey there at the other end of this road, up by where George Harrison lived. And he was just listing all these places, but he couldn't make it work, so he scrapped it and started again. But it started a conversation between him and Paul. Should they write about their childhood? So Paul started on Penny Lane. Of course, his big connection, as we've seen, is St Barnabas Church. But also, every day going to school and back from the age of 11, Paul was passing through here on the bus. He was going into Liverpool city centre to his high school, the Liverpool Institute. Of course, that's where Paul and George met, on the bus going into town to the school. So Paul was coming through Penny Lane, past the roundabout, every school day. So there's strong connections for all three of them. So Paul starts working on the song of the place, Here Beneath the Blue Suburban Skies. And there were some obvious people to think of and places to think of. So we'll go and think of those four characters who are mentioned in the song. It's the barber, the banker, the fireman and the nurse. Now the fireman is mentioned, but not the fire station. The fire station itself is about 3/4 of a mile this way, heading towards Allerton and to Paul's home at Fourth Inn Road. So Paul was passing the fire station every day to and from school. So he places the fireman here at Penny Lane, but not the fire station. One of the most interesting stories within the song of Penny Lane I discovered when I was writing Liverpool, my first book. So this was going back to around 2000, 2001, and I just started on it, just speaking to people who knew the Beatles. And one of the guys I spoke to was Stan Williams, and Stan told me the story of the Pretty Nurse. Now, we'd always assumed that the Pretty Nurse was in the song because Paul's mum had been a nurse. But no, Stan could tell me the real story, and it all happened here, right outside the shelter on the Penny Lane roundabout. So the story starts with John Lennon and his best friend Pete Shotton, and they'd been into Woolworths, and John liked to go in there and steal toys and everything he could, you know what he was like. And he and Pete walked down, came to the roundabout, and they stopped right here by the shelter. Standing here was this guy, Stan Williams, and he was talking to his childhood friend Beth Davidson. Beth was about 14 years old. She was a nurse cadet, and she was selling poppies for Remembrance Day. So we know it was somewhere around the end of October, beginning of November. So Stan and Beth are standing here when John and Pete walk up and they talk to her, and that's what's captured in the song. So why was John, first of all, writing anything in the song, and secondly, why was he writing about this nurse cadet? Well, the reason is John had started the inspiration for the song, so he wanted part of it. You know, this is where he grew up. But Beth, the nurse, was Pete Shotton's girlfriend and became Pete Shotton's wife. So John put his best friend's wife in a Beatles song and nobody knew about it. And we were able to put a photograph of Beth into the local paper, and two ladies contacted me, and they were the childhood friends of Stan and Beth, and verified exactly that Beth Davidson was the Pretty Nurse of Penny Lane, which also proves that John Lennon wrote the last verse, and Paul has confirmed that he said John came over and helped him with that verse. And if you study the lyrics, they are very different in style to the rest of the song. Very John as opposed to very Paul. On the corner was another bank. It's now the Penny Lane Hotel. But the main one we think is the bank, which makes the most sense, is this building here, which is now Penny Lane Surgery. There's the bank on the corner, and again, when I was researching Liverpool, came across a photo from 1956 which showed a car outside the bank. And the whole point is, not many people around here could afford cars, but the person who could was the bank manager. So Paul was writing about a figure of fun. Everybody knew him, and the children used to laugh at him behind his back. And just imagine you're Paul McCartney, you're standing here and it's wet and it's horrible. So who do you hate the most? Well, you hate the bank manager who's got his Mac, which he doesn't wear in the pouring rain, does he? His Macintosh raincoat, because he puts it on, he comes out of his bank, gets into his car and drives off. As we look at the top of Penny Lane, coming onto the roundabout, we go past the bank, and on the same block is Tony Slavin, the barbershop. Back then it was known as Bioletti's, and this is where John, Paul and George and lots of their friends came and got their hair cut. So it's still a barbershop, location, just a different name. If you go up that way, you get to George Harrison's house, and just a couple of roads up you get to 9 Newcastle Road, and that's where John first lived with his mum. Now the Penny Lane shopping mall and a pub on the corner. This was where the original tram sheds were. So when in John's original lyrics he talks about the tram sheds that were pulled down, this is where they were located, just off the Penny Lane roundabout. So we've only come a short distance from the roundabout, but already we're at Newcastle Road. This was a nice low middle class area, nice houses, definitely a step up from where Ringo and George were born and grew up. And this was John's house, number 9, Newcastle Road. 3-bedroomed house, kitchen, bathroom and toilet, and they were luxuries, believe me. The house was bought for way over the market price a number of years ago and has been completely renovated. Somebody's put a lot of money and love into this, and you are welcomed by Imagine, Peace and Welcome. So this is where John first lived. This is where the Penny Lane story starts. And this is where his interest in the number 9 started as well, because of course he was born on the 9th of October. And he lived at number 9. There's 9 letters in Newcastle as well. So I hope you've enjoyed this little trip along Penny Lane. I'm outside the bank. Just up the block is the barbershop. Right opposite me is the shelter in the middle of the roundabout. This was the childhood for John, Paul and George. You know, even when they were the quarrymen, they were meeting here, they were getting the bus to Penny Lane. So this was such an important song, which if you don't know even this part of Liverpool, the song will never make sense. If you've never been here, you don't understand the geography, it won't make sense. But this is it, this is Penny Lane, this is what the song means.